You ever get that feeling that, like, knot in your stomach when something totally unexpected hits you right in the wallet? Yeah, well, you're not alone. The global economy.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like it's been, I don't know, like throwing a huge curveball, and those ripples, they could definitely be hitting your doorstep too.
It's a really unstable time right now, economically speaking, driven by some, well, pretty forceful and unforeseen factors, I'd say.
Exactly. We're talking about all this uncertainty around, like, tariffs, the whole potential trade war thing, and all the craziness that causes in the markets. You know, it's almost like trying to stand up straight on a boat in really choppy water, economic whiplash, they call it, which is, I think, the perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really going to try to get under the hood of today and understand, what's actually causing this whole mess.
Right. We need to really dissect what specific policy shifts have triggered all this, and then, explore how that could potentially set off this whole chain reaction across, like, the entire global economic landscape.
And to help us make sense of all this, we're going deep diving into a recent discussion from the Better Policy podcast, where host Reece spoke with Douglas Laxton. And this isn't just some guy with an opinion, Doug is the director of the Better Policy Project, and probably even more importantly, he used to be the head honcho of economic modeling at the IMF.
Oh, yeah. So when it comes to understanding all the complexities of, the global financial system, he's operated at the very top.
Exactly.
And his experience, all those years at the IMF, provide a really valuable framework for understanding these kinds of, like, big economic shifts. His whole background in forecasting economic trends, that lends a lot of weight to his analysis of the current situation, basically.
So for everyone listening, today's mission is simple. To unpack this whole current economic climate, the one that's been, kind of ignited by these recent changes in trade policy, and to really get a handle on what it could mean for, like the world economy as a whole. So let's start unpacking, right? The first thing that really jumps out at me is this, pretty significant downturn we've been seeing in the markets. I mean, the S&P 500, it's taken a noticeable hit.
It really has. The drop is stark, to be honest. A 16% decline just since the end of 2024.
Wow.
Yeah. That kind of movement, especially in a major index like the S&P 500 and in such a short amount of time, that signals real concern among investors.
Big time. And according to Douglas Laxton, the main thing driving this whole dip seems to be what he calls, get this, misguided trade policy.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, this whole new wave of tariffs that the Trump administration started, targeting key sectors like steel, aluminum, and get this, now even automobiles.
Yeah, what I found really insightful in Laxton's analysis was it's not just that these tariffs have, these direct impacts like through increased costs and stuff, but he says the bigger, more immediate concern might actually be like the sheer uncertainty they generate. You know what I mean? Because investors, they really thrive on predictability. And when the future direction of trade policy is like totally cloudy, it creates this risk premium, which then leads to market adjustments. And It's not just the current tariffs themselves. It's the worry about like what might come next, how widespread these actions could become.
Yeah. It's like, imagine a business, right, trying to plan for the future, but the rules of the game keep changing without any warning.
Exactly.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. We've got this perspective from Europe that really adds a whole new layer to this situation.
Right. Laxton brings up this really blunt assessment from a European politician. It's a quote that kind of sticks with you,
Yeah.
This politician on some recent program just flat out said, we just got kicked in the butt.
Oh, wow.
Which is, it's a pretty direct way of acknowledging the impact of these U.S. trade policies. Let's just say that.
It is blunt, but yeah, it does get straight to the point, doesn't it? And the argument being made, which Laxton seems to support, is that these tariffs, as painful as they are right now, in the short term, they might actually be like a much needed wake-up call for the European Union.
Exactly. Laxton highlights how the European economy has, it's been facing some like underlying structural challenges for a while now.
Okay.
Like, think about it. The EU, it's a large economic bloc for sure.
Yeah.
But it still operates with this kind of fragmented internal market, There's still all these non-tariff barriers between member states, things like different product standards and regulatory hurdles that can really impede trade within the EU itself.
Wow.
And he also points to, the level of productivity in Europe. On average, it hasn't really kept pace with the US. So the suggestion here is that, the the EU's economic engine hasn't exactly been firing on all cylinders, so to speak.
Interesting. So as much as no one really welcomes tariffs and the economic friction they cause, and let's be clear, businesses and consumers really feel that, the argument is that this external pressure, it might actually force some, difficult but ultimately beneficial conversations and reforms within Europe.
Exactly. This pressure could lead to a real push to, streamline all those regulations, dismantle some of those internal non-tariff barriers, and create a more unified single market. And also to prioritize investments in areas that can really boost long-term productivity, innovation, and sustainable growth. It's about Europe looking inward and addressing some of these long-standing issues that might have been easier to ignore without this kind of external jolt.
Makes sense. And it's not just the EU that's in this position of reevaluation, is it?
No, it's not.
Laxton specifically mentions Canada as being in a, and I quote, similar spot, facing the implications of these shifts in U.S. trade policy.
Right, and you have to remember, these major economies, they're all interconnected. So when a big player like the U.S., changes its trade stance, the reverberations are felt everywhere. It makes these traditional allies really examine their own economic, vulnerabilities and, think strategically about how to ensure their long-term competitiveness in a global landscape that's constantly shifting.
So to kind of sum up this whole European angle, it seems like these tariffs, even though they're definitely causing some immediate economic headwinds, could also, ironically, be acting as a catalyst.
I think so.
They might be jolting some of our closest trading partners into taking a hard look at their own economic structures and, implementing reforms that could actually lead to stronger, more resilient growth in the long run.
It's definitely a possibility.
Now, let's shift gears back to the U.S. for a second, because the picture Laxton is painting there isn't exactly all sunshine and roses either. The term stagflation keeps coming up.
Yes. The possibility of stagflation is a major concern, for sure.
So, for anyone who's not, super familiar with economics jargon, can you break down what stagflation actually is?
Yeah, so stagflation is basically this, it's a pretty nasty economic scenario where you get hit with a double whammy. You've got rising inflation happening at the same time as the economy is slowing down, experiencing weak or even negative growth.
Not good.
No.
Not at all.
And Laxton doesn't sugarcoat it either. He calls this a nightmare scenario, specifically for central banks. Why does he see it as such a big problem for them?
Well, because it puts central banks in this incredibly difficult position, they're facing these conflicting objectives. Typically, when inflation starts rising, the standard response is to raise interest rates. That cools down the economy and helps bring prices under control.
However, if the economy is already weak or slowing down, raising rates could actually stifle growth even further.
No.
Right? And could even potentially push it into a recession. But then on the flip side, if they lower rates to try to stimulate a weak economy, that could make the already high inflation even worse.
A real catch-22.
It really is. It's a genuine lose-lose policy dilemma.
And what's particularly troubling, at least according to Laxton's analysis, is that this potential bout of stagflation in the U.S., it's not because of some classic external shock like, a sudden spike in oil prices, which has, caused stagflation in the past.
Yeah.
He's arguing that this time it's largely self-inflicted.
Right, and that is a critical distinction. Laxton's point is that a primary driver of this whole stagflationary environment is that very policy uncertainty we've been talking about. The unpredictable nature of and potential for these, trade policy decisions to escalate. It disrupts supply chains, increases costs for businesses because of tariffs, and just generally makes it harder for companies to invest and plan for the future, all of which can lead to both higher prices and slower growth,
Yeah. And this policy uncertainty, it's not just some abstract economic concept floating around out there, is it?
No, definitely not.
This is having a real tangible impact on things like how the equity markets are performing.
Oh, absolutely. Like we talked about earlier, that sharp drop in the S&P 500 since the beginning of 2025.
Yeah.
That's directly tied to this feeling of pervasive policy uncertainty. Investors, they don't like risk, and when the future direction of government policy, especially in areas as important as international trade, if it becomes unclear and potentially disruptive, they react. They start selling off riskier assets like stocks, which then leads to market downturns.
Right, which then has this whole domino effect, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not just impacting investors directly, but it also starts to chip away at the confidence of the average consumer. Laxton even says we need to watch out, that a recession might actually already be starting.
It's a real possibility when consumers see the value of their investments going down and they keep hearing about all this market volatility. It makes them less confident about the economy as a whole and about their own financial future. This drop in confidence can then lead to, them cutting back on spending, which, like you said, just further dampens economic activity and creates this negative feedback loop that could, definitely contribute to a recession.
Now, Laxton also brings up this other thing, which is that the whole inflationary environment we went through during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's adding another layer of complexity to all this and is making the current situation even more, precarious. So how does that past inflation actually factor into today's challenges?
So the key takeaway here is about how past experiences actually shape how people and businesses react to new inflationary pressures. After going through a period of significant inflation, like a lot of us did during the pandemic, people become a lot more sensitive to price increases. They're quicker to anticipate, even more inflation.
Yeah.
And this can lead to people changing their behavior. Like, consumers might start making purchases sooner just to avoid higher prices later, and businesses might be more likely to raise prices just because they anticipate their costs going up.
Right.
And this, unfortunately, can actually speed up the inflation process, makes it more entrenched and much harder for central banks to, regain control and maintain their credibility when it comes to managing inflation expectations.
And all of this, this market volatility, the rising inflation, it has a very real direct impact on people's household wealth, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
It's not just about these abstract economic indicators. It's about real people's money.
Exactly. Laxton points out this dramatic surge in U.S. household wealth that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was fueled by, a combination of things like government stimulus measures and the Federal Reserve's monetary policies, which really pushed up asset prices, especially in the stock market and housing. We saw this extraordinary increase, over $50 trillion in total U.S. household wealth.
50 trillion.
Yeah.
Wow. But, as they say, what goes up must come down.
Right.
At least sometimes. And with these recent declines we've seen in the equity markets, we're now seeing a pretty significant chunk of those gains, disappear.
Exactly. Laxton points out that we've already seen around $6 trillion in household wealth vanish, just as equity markets have contracted. And this isn't just some statistic, it means less financial security for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It could impact their spending, their ability to save for retirement, and just their overall economic well-being.
Okay, so last but not least, to really drive home how serious the current economic climate is, Laxton mentions this report, the Global Forecasting School's Global Economic Risk Assessment Report.
Oh, yeah.
Can you give us the main takeaways from that in light of everything we've been talking about?
Sure. Basically, the report is saying that the risk level for the global economy is higher than it was. And they're particularly worried about inflation sticking around and about the possibility of more policy missteps making the existing problems even worse. Laxton even mentioned that the next edition of the report, which is due out on April 21st, is expected to paint an even more, he said, sobering outlook.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so basically all the challenges and uncertainties we've been talking about today, they're probably going to intensify in the near future.
Well, that's not what I wanted to hear. So I guess to sum all this up for everyone listening, the message seems pretty clear. When trade policy is handled in a way that creates a lot of uncertainty and that uncertainty sticks around, the negative consequences are huge and they're widespread.
I'd agree with that.
It's not just about the stock market going up and down. It's about real people's lives and how they're able to make ends meet.
Exactly. The global economy is so interconnected that poorly thought out or unpredictably implemented trade policies, they can really drag down economic activity, lead to market instability, higher inflation, and just weaken the overall outlook for economic growth.
So, as a final thought for everyone out there listening, I want you to really think about how deeply connected global economies are these days.
Yeah.
It's the 21st century. Things are different. Policy decisions that are made on one side of the world, they don't just stay there. They have ripple effects, or as we've seen, maybe even like tidal waves that can spread far and wide.
Yeah.
So I think the question we all need to be asking ourselves is, what other unforeseen consequences might be lurking out there if this climate of trade uncertainty keeps going? Something we all need to watch very closely.
I think so too.